Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Simple Living High Thinking, where we unpack Tukaram Prabhu's Friday night Bhagavad Gita class. I'm joined by Tadeo Souza and Varangi Radha Devidasi. Thanks for joining, guys.
Haribo.
Hi.
And we are in towards the beginning of chapter 5, and we only went over one text last night, but it was such a great class. We actually dove deep into the Sanskrit this time. So looking forward to today's discussion. Today, do you want to set any sort of context for this text, this verse?
Yeah, so this verse is coming right after a set of texts which on the surface seem to have been paradoxical or at least contradictory. But then 2 classes ago, we troubleshot all of that, which is what we captured in our last episode. And this verse, it kind of takes us out of those seemingly contradictions, right? And just to make clear what it is that this apparent contradictions was, so that brings us right back to this class. Arjuna starts again chapter 5 by asking Krishna to be decisively, right? Just tell me either left or right, meaning is it better for me to work or not work? And again, showing another doubt, similar to how he started chapter 3. And Krishna responds by saying, hey, both work and renunciation are good for liberation, but of the two, work and devotion is best. So Krishna was quite decisive in his answer in that way, but then he makes this so-called seemingly contradictory statement, which is to say, but of the two, then work and devotion is better. So if they're both good for liberation, but of the two, there's one that is better, then how is that, right? So then we troubleshot that essentially by saying that the position that a person could attain by engaging in devotional service is such that it will include all that knowledge that a Sankhya, a person who is dedicating themselves to Sankhya, would have attained. Sankhya being the analytical study of material nature. So it's more of a position of knowledge, a position of where, in terms of a general class of people that strive to attain self-realization, that type of person would fall in the category of being more passive in the world, as opposed to the category of a person being more active in the world, which would have been the yogis, actually doing their duties in the world. And the people that dedicate themselves to the analytical study of material nature, namely Sankhya, falls in that category of people that are a little bit more passive. But then Krishna does say, but if you do engage yourself in works, especially in devotional works, you're not going to be deprived from the knowledge that a person that is more passive or inactive in the world and truly dedicate themselves to acquiring knowledge would have attained. But on the other hand, you're also going to possess that intellectual discrimination, that intellectual knowledge. So Krishna then does reconcile it by saying that if you do work, you also attain this knowledge, right? And but not necessarily the other way around. It's not really what Krishna says, that by only dedicating yourself to Sankhya, that you would attain the same position of somebody who dedicates themselves to devotional service. So by Krishna not making a two-way comparison here, then justifies him saying, yes, they're both going to elevate you, but of the two, work and devotion is better because you attain everything from the other path. And there's something that somebody who dedicates themselves strictly to Sankhya study would not necessarily attain in the same intensity that a person dedicated themselves to devotional service would. So I meant to make it a short introduction to bring context, but ended up being a little bit longer. Varangi, would you add anything to that?
I thought that was really tight and really clear. Thank you so much. I don't think it could have been explained in a more concise way because it's a heavy concept. And like, you know, Tukaram Prabhu took 2 hours to flesh it out for us. Not that he couldn't have done it in less time, but, you know, to be able to take us all at our own level, it did take that long for all of us to kind of grasp that concept. So I think your explanation really is tight and concise. I think one more thing that was brought up that is important to even just mention, because it does come up in the Gita, is the possibility that there could be somebody in the world that is ready to give up, you know, their engagement in this world, and that is their dharma. That is something appropriate for that person. It's far and few between. It doesn't happen very often, but Krishna certainly leaves that room, that door open, to say, yeah, there could be somebody that is actually, because again, we understand that the soul transmigrates from life, from one body to another. This person, because of their journey, could be ready to be in a different kind of path, right? And so I know that Krishna will explain this further in the 6th chapter. And so, and then later on in the Gita as well, he fleshes this out. So it's not something that we want to focus on this early on, but it is something that comes up later on. So it's important to mention that it's not, that Krishna does also give that space for those very few people that are ready to take on that path. Again, it's not everybody, and the majority of us cannot do that. A lot of us try to do that artificially, especially early on in our lives, right? But then we quickly find out that the only way to actually make progress is by doing things in a progressive, regulated way. And in this way, we actually develop that attachment for what is good for spiritual life and develop detachment for that which doesn't help as much. And that's what most of us need to go through in order to actually make some advancement and growth. And so, yeah, that's the only thing I wanted to add, was that this will be mentioned later on. So it would be helpful to just bring it up as well. Although that's not the point of this chapter or concept particularly, but there is room for that. So, yeah.
Also, would you guys expand a little bit on the difference between sannyasis within the Hare Krishna movement, Krishna consciousness, and the sannyas, the historical sannyas definition, so to speak, that was referred to here in the Gita? Because I found that really interesting when Tukaram pointed that out.
Yeah, that was great.
Sure. The ISKCON teachers, gurus, we refer to them as sannyasis. It is a bit of a incomparability with what is being taught in the Bhagavad Gita right now. The sannyasi that Krishna is speaking about here is the person who renounces the world completely. And by that we mean including their duties. So they literally turn their backs on society, on everybody around them, and let's say family, work, of any kind. And they really, literally, this is the type of people that Varangi was describing. There are very few people that can actually be in this position, because they literally would go to a cave, like in the Himalayas, and be there, like in still, empty meditation for a really long time, and they're literally renouncing everything. It's really difficult for us to even find somebody that could do that, let alone do that while attaining spiritual elevation, right? So it's really tough, and it really doesn't come around very often. And these are the sannyasis that are being described in the Gita here, when Krishna is telling Arjuna. These are not the sannyasis in ISKCON. We refer to them as sannyasis more in terms of contrasting the 4 different stages you can be in ISKCON, which is brahmachari and vanaprastha.
Grahastha.
Sorry?
Brahmachari, Grahastha.
Sorry. Brahmacharis, grihastas, vanaprasthas, and sannyasis. And I'll quickly describe that. So a brahmachari is relatively younger. They just started that path. and they usually live in a particular ashram, temple, and they take guidance from their spiritual masters and their community around, but they're pretty much fixed in a position of a student, and that's a brahmachari. A grihastha, traditionally speaking, is a person who then grew older from the brahmachari position and starts a family. So they actually get married and move out of the ashram, out of the temple, into their homes with their spouses, and they have children. So, but they are still 100% devoted to spiritual life. It's an important point here, because you're no longer at the temple, you're by yourself, you're now engaging in sexual activities to have children, whereas brahmacharis could not, they're celibates. So a grihastha, in one sense, have the license to procreate, but they're now living at home. But they're very serious there. We have deities in their homes, they will offer the foods, they will chant their rounds, they will not partake in the 4, let's say, forbidden activities that they took a vow they wouldn't. So that's a grihastha. Then later, as you continue to advance and you're a bit older, let's say your children are older and capable of taking care of themselves, and your spouse is also older, but capable of taking care of themselves as well, right? Not that you're so old that, let's say, the wife is so old that she wouldn't need care from somebody else, right? Not in that position, but let's say around there, between 50 and 60s, something like that. Then traditionally the husband and also the wife sometimes, more traditionally the husbands, but we do have some Varnaprastha females also, but then they separate. They again embrace a position where 100% of their life is dedicated to devotional service to Krishna, and that is called Varnaprastha. They go away from their families and they no longer have a fixed home and they travel the world. Then when you again make more progress and you grow a little even older, you take sannyasi. And again, all that I'm saying here is generally speaking. There are exceptions to all of these rules that I'm saying. For example, in the beginning of the Hare Krishna movement, what are now our gurus, they took sannyas and they were much younger than the traditional sannyas of today. And also there are some brahmacharis that never leave the temple. They've been living in the temple for decades, and they certainly are even older than grihasthas and varnaprasthas, but they're still brahmacharis in the temple. So there are some exceptions. So I'm speaking generally here. Whereas a sannyasi, generally speaking, then they fully renounce any activity that would serve themselves, right? They are now only living for the purpose of others and giving Krishna consciousness, bhakti yoga to others. And they're like literally like just traveling, essentially a continuation of Varnaprastha, but way more serious now, very, very renounced. So that's the sannyasi, right, that we have in ISKCON. But they are traveling, they are translating books, they are taking disciples, they are caring for their disciples' spiritual progress, which contrasts to the sannyasi being described in the Gita, which will do nothing, will only care, not necessarily in a bad way that they're so selfish, just a tinge of that, but they're caring mainly about themselves because they're turning their back in the entire society. They have so much wisdom to give to others, but they're not. They're just caring for themselves. Whereas our sannyasis, they're very much engaged still in the world. So we refer to them as sannyasis, but they are not these sannyasis that are being described in the Gita, because the sannyasi of the Gita fully renounced everything, and the sannyasis in ISKCON, they're still very much engaged. In fact, the sannyasis in ISKCON should really be what we are going to be referring to in chapter 18 as tyagis. So a more precise description of ISKCON's gurus would be to refer to them as tyagis, because a tyagi is fully renounced, but they're still engaged in the world for the purpose of giving self-realization and love of Krishna to others, right? So again, that was a bit long, but I want to honor your question.
No, thank you. That was very thorough. Yeah.
I think a question that naturally could arise is, well, we just explained that the sannyas, like the meaning of sannyas that's given in the Gita, and this part of it is talking about somebody that is ready to give up all action and connection really to materialism for the purposes of spiritual realization. And then we're comparing them to Vaisnava sannyasis who are still engaged in this world. So somebody could very easily think, oh, okay, then they're not as advanced as somebody that could give it all up, because that's really hard. So the fact that Vaishnava gurus don't give up action, it must be because they're still attached, or they're still struggling with, their feelings and their senses, and they still need to do something in this world and to make that advancement. And so a question or a solution to that question is that actually the Vaishnava, not even just the sannyasis, but the bhakti yogis, at whatever stage you're in, the whole purpose is to learn this knowledge and this practice from your teachers and apply it to your life and strive to master it. And then simultaneously, you want to share it with other people. And this is the greatest treasure that we get from our lineage of teachers. And so I think it's a gift and a responsibility that the bhakti yogi receives. And so not only do we take it and we cultivate it and we become self-realized on our own, but we also take the responsibility for sharing this knowledge and this practice with other people so they can also do the same. So when we are talking about our teachers and we mentioned ISKCON, of course, ISKCON was founded about 50 years ago by Srila Prabhupad, but the Hare Krishna movement, although it wasn't known as the Hare Krishna movement before that time, has been going on for millennia, and there's different lineages under that same umbrella. So, but when we stated, ISKCON, because that's what commonly now is known by, and also it is our group, our tribe, and so we're trying to explain it that way. It's our teachers are representing their commitment and their loyalty to their teacher, who's really giving away to their disciples that spirit of being a missionary. So that's what the bhakti yogi strives to be, not only to become self-realized, but to really share that with other people. And that is commonly known as missionary work, and in any tradition, really. And so we see that although these gurus, our teachers, are completely self-satisfied, they are completely married to Krishna, they're completely living for a higher purpose. And we see this in the way they speak, the way they live, the way they relate to each other and to the world. They're so detached, but at the same time, they're so attached to work in devotion, that service that we call it, or Srila Prabhupada so expertly explains it as. And so we see how what Krishna is actually speaking about very clearly, of how we should still act in this world for a higher purpose, and at the same time be detached from whatever happens in this world, because that person, that yogi, understands that everything in this world is fickle and it's going to fade, right? And so our gurus really exemplify that highest mood and I think goal, right, of still being a part of this world, not for themselves and not to satisfy their senses, but purely 100% for the benefit of other people. And we read that one over and over again in scripture, in these texts, how that's the greatest action anybody could do in life. And I know Soza Prabhu has mentioned this verse also many times over, and I would say that's probably one of your favorite verses, where Krishna declares that one person that studies this knowledge and shares it to others, that person is the most dear to me. So when we think about our gurus, that's actually the type of person Krishna is talking about. That person that has no interest in gaining something for themselves, or to make themselves more comfortable or richer or more famous or have more women or any of that, but they engage in this world for the benefit of other people. And at the same time, they are very detached and in a way really exemplify that sannyas that Krishna is talking about here, but that's internal. So internally, they're completely detached and really just focused on their relationship with Krishna. But externally, they are engaging in the best type of welfare work, which is the distribution of spiritual knowledge and missionary work. And so I just wanted to bring this up because it's very easy to make that connection and maybe not even talk about it, but just think, oh, okay, then these gurus that are not in the Himalayas, they must be lower, like at a lower stage. And so I hope that this clarifies that and really shed some light on the distinction and why doing work for the right reasons is actually the highest. It doesn't matter what stage you're in, but especially in the sannyas stage of your life, that's actually what we're all training to become, to be completely engaged in this world for the benefit of everybody and completely detached for our own benefit, right? Doing things for our own benefit. So I just wanted to bring that up.
The other point, thank you, Varangi, that was excellent. And another point is, quickly on this subject, is that it's also very important to define what we mean by our terms and our objectives. So the central point being discussed here is renunciation, because a sannyasi will renounce the world, whereas somebody who is not completely renounced is still engaged in the world. So renunciation is the center of discussion here, right? And Krishna, the Supreme Person, has an opinion of what does renunciation mean. Those yogis that are renouncing the world, they're doing so by taking themselves out of the world and not engaging in activities anymore. And to them, the definition of renunciation is that I will stop acting in the world and therefore I will have no more karma, no more reaction, because what keeps me bound to the world is the karmic reactions that I have to enjoy or suffer based on my actions. So then they think, well, if I renounce activities altogether, there will be no more karma, there will be no more reactions for me to suffer or enjoy, and therefore I will attain liberation. So they choose the path of renunciation for that purpose. But Krishna has a different idea of what renunciation means and how do you become renounced. And Krishna will state himself in chapter 18 as well. So I'm jumping a little bit ahead. But he says that true renunciation, meaning renouncing the fruitive activities that we perform in the world. We renounce the results of our fruitive activities in the material world. And that is true renunciation. Not that you don't act, you act for the purpose of helping others, for the purpose of giving Krishna consciousness to others. But you're doing so for their, like Varangi just mentioned, you're doing so for their benefit, you're doing so to please Krishna. It is not meant for you. You are renouncing anything that is to please yourself. And that is true renunciation. Not abstaining from action, but renouncing sense gratification through your material activities is true renunciation. So by defining renunciation as per the Supreme Person, Krishna, then there's no problem if you are actually working in the world because you renounced the results of that. And that is true renunciation. That's the true sannyasi.
Yeah, thank you. I thought that was important, defining the terms. Otherwise, if I'm thinking it means something and you're speaking because you have a different understanding. Right. So I thought that was really helpful. And also I just thought of something. It's so amazing. All these topics, you think it's like, okay, let me just define this, but everything is so tied together. But yeah, I think the discussion really links nicely to this week's text 7. So I don't know if you want to jump right into that.
Yeah. We haven't even gotten to the verse yet. I mean, already so much to explore already.
Right.
And I can't help, but I have to say something else. I think it's part of my nature. I always like to look behind, like our philosophy, our actions, our objectives, like the motives and so on. And something that somebody may think is that, well, this idea of renunciation, why are we valuing it so much, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
what is renunciation all about? So I want to really highlight the mood of such a renouncer, a person who is renouncing. It's not that I'm saying, oh, I'm only going to care about others. I'm truly altruistic, right? I don't care about myself. I don't want to please my senses, my eyes, my ears. Like, I don't want to hear something nice or anything. It seems so dry and so cold. Then, okay, when I'm renouncing everything, then what am I doing here? Like, what is going to motivate me to do anything, right? I want to highlight the mood, the affection, the sentiment of somebody who truly embraces this mood of renunciation. They're doing so because they are so much in love with Krishna. Krishna is a person, and they love Krishna so much that they cannot help but to only think about pleasing Krishna, and pleasing themselves becomes secondary. Again, as a father, I can speak that, yes, I look forward to pleasing my senses because I am not a 100% transcendental bhakti yogi yet. So there are things that I will do. And I must admit, like, I'm looking forward to seeing the sunset at the beach or hanging out with the people that I like and having conversations with them, right? And I'm pleasing myself. But when I'm doing something to please, like, my children, I'm more absorbed in it. Like, it's the intensity of the activities that I do. I look forward to it more than if it was for myself. Like, it's really hot right now. I go to the beach and I look forward to jumping in the ocean because it's refreshing. And I derive satisfaction from that. But when my son, who is just now losing his fear of the small waves, when he jumps in and he's like having so much fun, to me, that is more satisfying. And I'm there for him. And it's not for me at this point, it is just for him. And that's more intense. The satisfaction I derive from that is more intense. So these renunciates that we are talking about here is not that they're empty and dry and have no satisfaction. In fact, the satisfaction that they are feeling is all internal and spiritual. So it's not that they are neglecting their senses and they're super dry. They are actually not trying to be renounced either. There's not something that they have to do. It's just they can't help but to do everything for Krishna because they love Krishna so much. So that's really the mood of a renunciate also.
Thank you. That's it. That was the point I was gonna bring up exactly. And Krishna's so kind that he inspired you to say this, because you said it so much, infinitely more times better than I could have. But that was my point. It's not that they're repressed. It's not that they're self-abnegating. It's not like they're like this grumpy old man or woman that's like can't like look at other people and doesn't want to, but internally really wants to. No, it happens naturally. And like you so expertly said, they have the greatest thing that anybody could have, which is a really deep and strong relationship with the Supreme, who is described as the roots of a tree. And when we water the roots of the tree, then the whole tree flourishes. So they have found out how to connect to the root, which is Krishna. And so that's the greatest source of happiness and satisfaction, and all that surpasses anything else that they could find in this world. And that's why we see that it's so easy, right? Because they've done the work, it's so easy for them to be detached. And at the same time, it's so easy for them to give themselves completely to the mission, their mission that has been passed down from teacher to teacher. And that is their life and soul. And so we see that mood being, passed down, and it's so not adulterated. It's very pure, because it's something that you can't really fake. You can fake being into a sports team and you really hate it because like your boyfriend likes it very much and you don't want to like him to break up with you or something. But when it comes to devotional service, to things like that, there's a certain point where if you're not purified enough, it's not something you can hang or continue doing for a long time. And that's why a regulated process is not so, I guess, recommended. Yeah, we hear Krishna here recommending it, and we hear it from our teachers. But at a certain point, we can also look to them and see, oh, that's where I'm headed. You know, that's the goal. And so I really, I'm glad that you brought that up and you explained it in such a wonderful way, because that's exactly what I thought. I was like, oh, somebody may think, oh, they're just like grumpy and repressed, and they really like want to experience life and they can't. But if you've done it properly and correctly, then you actually are enjoying the most, because you are connecting with who you truly are as a spiritual being, and not trying to find satisfaction in stuff that you're not, like with matter, materialism. So yeah, I thought that was an important point to bring up. Thank you.
Yes, our His Holiness Devramita Swami Maharaj. Once I was speaking with him, one-on-one actually, was very lucky that day. And we are having a discussion similar to this about sannyasis not having a family, not having children, not having a family anymore. And he got into some kind of trance and his eyes closed, which usually he has. And I just made that point. It wasn't really a question or anything. I kind of like just made the point, and he went quiet. He sat quiet for a moment, then he's opened his eyes and he said the following. He says, yes, generally, people cannot understand how a sannyasi can conceive of the entire world as their family. So the point being is that I have my family, it's 5 people. And it's very easy for me to care and love 5 people and deal with their problems and help them navigate the world and be a role model for them. Well, but what if it's 10 people? It's a little bit more challenging. What if it's 100? What if it's 1,000 people? Well, what if, per his answer, what if it's the entire world? So like, I don't have like a biological family, but the entire world to me is my family. I love everybody. So it shows the limitations of my capability of love. Because I can love my 5 direct family members very intensely, right? And my extended family as well, of course. But how about being able to love the entire world, including the animals, to the same intensity that I love my family? That's what's going on in the heart of a sannyasi, you know?
I'm so excited because this next verse is exactly about this topic. So it's like so perfect. I actually think it's so mystical how the conversation has evolved in such a natural way, but it's exactly what we're talking about. It's really, I guess, part of an explanation of the 7th text, which is really wonderful. Anyway, I'm excited to get to it.
And we don't normally do this, but Varangi, would you mind reading the Sanskrit as well as the English translation, since we'll be getting into that?
You read so nicely, Kim. I was looking forward to hearing you read the text. I'll try, okay? Yoga yukto visuddhatma vijitadma jitendriya. Sarva bhutadma bhutadma karvan apina lipyate. One who works in devotion, who is a pure soul, and who controls his mind and senses is dear to everyone, and everyone is dear to him. Though always working, such a man is never entangled. And that's the translation, obviously, by His Divine Grace, I see Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. And like Kim mentioned earlier, we had a special class, because although Tukaram Prabhu's classes are always focused on Sanskrit and really diving into breaking up the words and analyzing them and then comparing them to the word-for-word translation to really appreciate Prabhupada's work, although he always does that, and that is really one of my favorite things about his teaching style. This last class was completely dedicated to diving into the Sanskrit and explaining it in such a deep way. And then, again, talking about where Prabhupada comes in and his expert and brilliant translation work, and what that means is, even from a material perspective of a translator in this world of material topics, and how Prabhupada fits into that as well, not only in spirituality or for spiritual topics, but just in general in the translating world or the art of translating, and how his position is actually still as exalted as it is in the spiritual realm. So I don't, do any of you, either one of you, would like to talk about anything that stood out to you from the Sanskrit explanation of it, or the translation, or in general how this verse ties into what we've been through this far?
Kim?
Well, I definitely appreciated Tukram going into even how words are conjugated in Sanskrit and how that leads to how you might translate something. I liked how he called out the difference between I apologize if I'm butchering the pronunciation, but Visu Sadatma and Vijatatma, and Jitendriya, particularly Vijatatma and Jitendriya, where Vijatatma is one who has conquered himself or controlled himself. But then Jitendriya is the one whose senses are conquered. So at first glance, it might seem like, well, isn't that kind of saying the same thing? But then he was saying that Vijatatma, the one who has conquered himself or controlled himself, could refer to controlling the mind. And so Krishna's not really being redundant. He's talking about controlling the body, and that can be synonymous with controlling your senses. So to me, it made sense that he would also mention, the translation, the difference between those two words, which are kind of similar, but that speaks to the beauty of translation and knowing how to pull out the meaning of the words. So
That was precisely my understanding of this too, Kim. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'm going to expand on that a little bit. And I have a verse that I want to quote to justify my expansion of it, which is on chapter 3, text 6. That text reads, "One who restrains the senses of action, but whose mind dwells on sense objects, certainly deludes himself and is called a pretender." So, as you pointed out, Kim, let me go back. So this is 5:7 now. So Vijatma, if we think about that as controlling the bodies, the self, let's say, the mind, and the Jitendriya, to having controlled the senses. Well, in the West world, we don't really conceive of the mind as a sense, that there is no real clear separation between mind, intelligence, and ego. In the Eastern world, this is more prominent. But here, there is a point that Krishna went really deep, I believe. That's why I read that text from chapter 3. It is possible for you to control your senses. Like we have senses that serves as input, information input, and then we have senses that we use as output. So for example, the eyes, the ears, and our tongue, in terms of tasting food, they're all senses of input. But then our legs, our arms, are the senses we are used to then, with the information we captured from the input senses, to then output them in the world, right? So you see or you hear something nice, and you're attracted to that something, you want to get close to it, then you use your legs as a sense to approach that thing, right? So then there's input, output senses. So Krishna, is so personable, so he's a conscious being, and he knows that, right? That there's the separation. So you can control your senses to the extent that you use your legs to walk to the temple. You're sitting in front of your teacher, and you're using your eyes to look, you're using your ears to hear, and it seems on the surface that all of your senses, whether input or output, are controlled. But your mind is gone somewhere else. You are thinking about, well, what I'm going to watch on TV when I get home, or when is prasad going to be served, because I'm hungry right now. And your mind is not even there. So that's why I read that verse, because Krishna is saying, hey, you may you may have conquered your senses, but your mind is still dwelling in the sense objects. So there's no room for you not to be completely in love with Krishna, because your input-output senses have to be firing the same way, and your mind also is also attached to Krishna, right? So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because, yes, it is not redundant here. That's my take. I don't think it's redundant. I think Krishna's motives by saying that is the same reason why he spoke 3:6, chapter 3, text 6, to illustrate the fact that, yes, your senses can apparently be controlled, but how about your mind? Because the word is vijja atma. Atma could also refer to the mind. So you can control your senses. You look very nicely, instantly, you're in the right place and so on, but where is your mind, right? So then your mind is also controlled. I think Krishna here is trying to not leave any room for you to not be completely dedicated to him. Your senses and your mind, they're both controlled, right?
I muted myself. I'm like, oh, how do I get sorry. Yeah, what a brilliant connection, Prabhu. I that's really nice. And I think that really serves as support for your statement that it's not actually redundant. It's Krishna covering all bases.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree. I think it's one points to more of the subtle body, right? The subtle internal state, and
Yes.
one points to the gross aspect of, you know, our senses on our body and our interaction with this world. And I think that verse 6 in the 3rd chapter really points to how specific Krishna wants to be. It's like, it's not enough for you to be renounced outside. If internally you're still attached, then you're a pretender. Like, don't do it that way. It's better for you to be attached and do it in a regulated way, understanding that there's something higher than you need to work towards, than to pretend that you're not attached, but really you are. Exactly. And so I think this verse really really points to how exact Krishna wants to be, and really just what a perfect teacher he is. He leaves no hole for the student to get lost through, or even come up with his or her own explanation for what he meant to say. It's like, no, actually, this is exactly what I mean. And I think this is a great point to, or space or time to link it to Prabhupada's translation. You know, it's so smooth, and I know this was talked about in the class. Prabhupada translates it as somebody who's a pure soul. So somebody that actually realizes that he is an eternal servant of Krishna. That's like, you're pure, you have no longer any contamination, obviously superficial contamination, because it's pure entities, as spiritual entities, we could never be contaminated, essentially, really. But there's no illusion thinking that we're not this soul or this spiritual entity. So Vijitatma, no, not Vijitatma, Visuddhatma, a purified soul. So Prabhupada translates it as a pure soul, and one who controls his mind and senses. So then he groups the mind and senses, the mind as being part of the senses, just in a subtle way. And like you explained, a lot of us in the Western world don't really think about our mind as part of our senses. We think that we are our mind. We think that we are our thoughts. So here Krishna or Prabhupada is so expertly grouping the mind with the senses, and to explain again what you have already so expertly explained, that his mind and his bodily actions are on the same path. They're on the same page. And also transcendentally, he's already achieved that knowledge that he is a pure spirit soul, that he is a part of the divine, and therefore he's a divine entity. And so there are actually two different categories, and Krishna is explaining with each one of these two words something completely different, I would say, although related. I think in general, when I read this verse, I really was inspired about how this verse really brings everything together. that we've been through, the whole Gita up to this point. It's Krishna is really in such a concise way explaining everything else he's already explained, and kind of like in a bow, like this is the bow to tie that box of everything we've been through, Arjuna, right? Everything I've tried to explain to you. And so, you know, he talks about somebody that's yoked or connected to yoga, to working in this world, as not being entangled by that work. So that person who is consciously working for something higher is not entangled. Also, that's that person that is a purified soul, somebody that has already gone through this process of purification and has realized that they are actually a spiritual entity, is not entangled by work in this world. Also, that person who is able to control his mind and his senses is able to work in this world and not be entangled or degraded or imprisoned by this work. And this same person, because of all these other qualities that he or she has developed, is also able to love everybody, and everybody's able to love him, because, and again, I think this is what I was referring to, that it's so beautiful what we were talking about before, because it directly relates to this text about, you know, our teachers. You know, they really love everybody. They like care so much about us. Even Prabhupada, I never met him, but I feel like, 100% he saved my life, and he loves me so much. I feel his love through everything he has done and established and taught us, and even through his books. He's still alive in my life. And so we are able to really witness this love that these exalted spiritual beings have for the world, and it's very natural for the world to also love them back, because it's such a pure connection. There's nothing that they're trying to get out of you, which is so different from the way that we interact with other people in the material world, right? And so I thought I was really inspired by this. And of course, I read the purport, because I'm like, okay, I want to know what Prabhupada really has to say about this. It was a wonderful class, but I was really wanting to know where he would take this verse, or how. And Prabhupada connects each aspect of this verse in such a powerful way that it let us know how one thing is connected to the other in such a simple and clear way. So let me read it so you know what I'm talking about. So this person who's on this path of liberation by Krishna consciousness, or work for something higher at this point, I guess, is very dear to every living being, and every living being is very dear to him or her. This is due to his Krishna consciousness, or his level of God realization. Such a person could not think of any living being as separate from Krishna, just as the leaves and branches of a tree are not separate from the tree. He knows very well that by pouring water on the root of the tree, the water will be distributed to all the leaves and branches, or by supplying food to the stomach, the energy is automatically distributed throughout the body. Because one who works in Krishna consciousness is servant to all, he is very dear to everyone. So we were talking about our teachers, right? Their whole life is service to everybody else. So naturally, when somebody does something super nice for us, we immediately feel a connection and we feel indebted. So there's love, even if you don't know the person, you know? And so Prabhupada is so expertly explaining this. So, and because everyone is satisfied by his work, by his or her work, meaning this person that is being described in this verse, he is pure in consciousness. So his consciousness is pure because everybody's so satisfied with the service he's providing or she is providing. Because he is pure in consciousness, his mind is completely controlled. So the mind has no thirst or hankering for accepting and rejecting anymore, because it's satisfied, because the consciousness is leading the mind to be satisfied, and the consciousness again is being led by service and purified by service. And because his mind is controlled, his senses are also controlled. So we see here a hierarchy of how everything is connected, how it's impossible to control our senses if our mind is not controlled, and it's impossible to control our mind if our intelligence isn't controlled, and how we cannot control our intelligence if we're not connecting our life to a higher consciousness, which is God consciousness, through service, right? Because his mind is always fixed on Krishna, there's no chance of his being deviated from Krishna, nor is there a chance that he will engage his senses in matters other than the service of the Lord. He does not like to hear anything except topics relating to Krishna. He does not like to eat anything which is not offered to Krishna. And he does not wish to go anywhere if Krishna is not involved. Therefore, his senses are controlled. A man of controlled senses cannot be offensive to anyone. And one may ask, why then was Arjuna offensive to others? Wasn't he in Krishna consciousness? This is relating into the battle, which I thought was so, just again, blew my mind. Arjuna was only superficially being offensive because as it has already been explained in the second chapter, all the assembled persons, everybody that was on the battle, would continue to live individually as the soul cannot be slain. So he's, again, just dropping so much knowledge. Again, Arjuna was just superficially being involved in killing. He wasn't really killing anybody because we already learned in the second chapter that we're not this body. And he was actually just following the instructions of his guru, which is Krishna, for a higher purpose. So I just thought the way he explained it and how everything is connected really shows how this process, this spiritual process, is actually a scientific process. It's like everything is connected and everything has a reason for being, and how we can't really get to see unless we first go through A and B, and how this we can actually get to a stage of complete renunciation if we start this process and maintain it appropriately and with the correct guidance, right? And so anyway, I just wanted to bring that up because I was loving how this verse really ties everything together, and how Prabhupada gave that formula that explains the thought process of Krishna. It's like, why does he link all these things up? And then Prabhupada really explains, oh, this is linked because of this and that. So I just wanted to share that. It really was, when I read it, I was like, wow, this makes so much sense. And it's so clear and easy to follow. And wherever you're at, you can be like, you can say, oh, okay, I'm still not controlling my senses, so I need to start with that. But then really, in order to get here, I need to really just start working for a higher purpose. And then, which is really going back to the third chapter in Krishna, just following Krishna's process. And yeah, just so clear on how to get from point A to point C or Z, really.
I look at this verse as being, per what you said, Varangi, a summary of everything we've covered thus far in the Gita. And I've read it with those eyes after I heard you saying it. And then I'm reading it thinking like what has been covered so far, right? And indeed, this verse over here, it's so full and complete that is just showing Krishna's brilliance as a teacher, right? He's dropping these verses here and there, which in a nutshell, which is so brilliant, summarizes it all. And is so complete in itself. And I just think it's so beautiful. There is also another point. So Tukaram was explaining to us that these first words, let's say yoga yukta and visuddhamatma, vijatma, and jitendriya, they are all compound Sanskrit words, right? So they have two meanings. The first one, yoga yukta, yoga meaning what we are striving to become bhakti yogis, right? So the union, yoga means union, in this case, union with God. Yukta, they share the same root. So if I am yoged to yoga, it's almost what you would sound like in English, this compound Sanskrit. However, if we do a clear reading of Sanskrit, there's no bhakti in here. But Prabhupada translates this as one who is working in devotion. And the word devotion is being injected here by Prabhupada. And one may ask, is Prabhupada's translation credible enough? Because it's injecting words that are not there in the original Sanskrit. Well, there are, I'm gonna just say one small thing about this, and then I will ask Varangi to comment a little bit more on these translations and why, however you wanna do it, Varangi, but Prabhupada is injecting this wording here, right? I just wanna say one thing about that. Took around in class, it was, again, impressing me because he said, yeah, and in 62 verses from this verse, Krishna will explain who the highest yogi is, which is the bhakti yogi, and therefore justifies Prabhupada injecting the bhakti aspect of an yogi here. And I'm like, 62 verses, like, that doesn't take us to the end of this chapter, I think. Like, it may lead us into the next chapter. Like, how does he know that it's 62 verses from this verse precisely? And the fun thing is that if you actually count and you go, he's like his own point. He's like, do you memorize all of this stuff? And you know all these little secrets. Like, oh yeah, in 62 verse from this verse, Krishna says the thing that justifies Prabhupada injecting this word in here, you know? So it's like, it's so nice. But anyways, so Varangi Radha Devidasi is actually a professional translator in a court, actually. So it's not just a light translation. It's, I would say, in one sense, heavy because you're in the court. Like, there's a judge there. There's somebody whose life can be altered one way or another based on what's being said. And Varangi is there actually translating it, having to do an extraordinary job at capturing what's being said to an audience of people who are not familiar with, let's say, somebody who is being accused of something, right? That's why he's before a judge. Well, now, and correct me if I'm wrong, Varangi, this is what I think happens. I served as a juror. Yeah.
Juror.
So I'm a little bit familiar. Well, there's 12 people here who are not familiar with what happened. And then now there is a judge who is trying to make the law very objective, right? But essentially there's a conversation taking place in here, and these 12 people who does not know this person who's been accused of something now needs to know. So the job of the translator is very, like, in that sense, heavy. Like, you have to be very responsible. You have to really know what you're doing to convey the proper message to people who are not familiar with the subject at hand. And sometimes it's tricky because of language, me having my mother tongue being Portuguese and then learning English, I know that there are many words or sentences that does not translate. They simply don't translate properly. If you do a literal translation, you will miss the audience because it will not make sense to them. So you have to be familiar enough with both cultures to know that your translation, although slightly different from what was actually said in the original language, it still captures all the value in the original message that is supposed to be delivered to the audience. So a translator is dealing with all of that. And Varangi here, being the best translator around us, has what I would say a very valuable insight into what's being done here by Prabhupada, how he's doing it, what is his task. It's not simple to just translate these things, right? So, and I pointed out, like, you know, the word devotion is not here, but he put it in there. Is this mistranslation? Is this just reading ahead and giving us what's going to happen anyways? So Varangi, how do you see all this, being a professional translator yourself?
Well, I think, let me just define the term, since that's something we learned in this episode, right? So translation is taking something that's in a source language, in this case is Sanskrit, and converting it into a target language. Translation is written work. The same thing happens orally, which is was what I was doing at the court system, and that's called interpreting or interpretation. So it's the same thing from a target language to a source language. I'm sorry, from a source language to a target language, but it's oral, so that's interpretation, and translation work is written, but it's the same action. Now, it's very widely known misconception that a translator is supposed to explain things and water down terminology for somebody that doesn't know or doesn't understand at the register or at the level of vocabulary that the source language is at. And that's a misconception. The translator's job or the interpreter's job is not to water down anything or to add, embellish, or to omit, take away anything from the target language or from the source language. The translator or interpreter's job is to take whatever is being said or written in this source language and convert it into this target language at the same register, not watering anything down and not lifting the register in any way, but in such a way that a native speaker of the source language can understand completely what the source language is intending to convey. Now, like you said, I worked in the court system for some years, and that the court system is a whole different, or the legalese, which is called the vocabulary of legal stuff. It's a whole new language, right? And so as an interpreter, we weren't allowed to explain what arraignment meant. Like the first time I read that, I was like, what is an arraignment? I've never heard of that. I never use it in normal language. An arraignment is a proceeding when people show up. If you've done something wrong, you show up to your court date, and then the judge reads you what you did wrong and what you're being accused of. Not what you did wrong, but what you're being accused of, the charges against you. That's really what arraignment means. But I can't, as a translator or as an interpreter, explain that to the person that doesn't know English because, well, I'm a Spanish translator, interpreter. So the only thing I'm doing is, there is a terminology specifically for arraignment, and I'm just saying that in Spanish, but I can't go into detail adding more stuff that isn't there. Now, if the person still doesn't understand, then the person has to say in whatever their language is, I don't understand, can you please explain? And the interpreter or translator would repeat that in English. I don't understand, can you please explain it? Then the source language has to explain that. The translator is just a voice. So now taking that into, is that clear so far?
Yes, and thank you for defining it, the translator versus the interpreter. So thank you for that. But it does make sense so far to me.
Yeah. Great. So then we go into the Gita. And so naturally, after hearing what I just said, some of you may be thinking, oh, well, then Prabhupada is guilty of embellishing. He's adding stuff that's not there, really for us to understand even more. And I would say that no, actually there's also other components of translation that is very critical and very vital to produce or provide high level translation or interpretation. And that is that the job of the translator is not to literally translate word for word. It is to make sense in the same register, in the same level of what is being said in the source language, in the target language here being English, and the source language being Sanskrit. So an example of that you brought up was yoga yukta, right? Yoga, we've learned that it's working in this world, karma yoga, working in this world, but not being attached to the result or offering a little bit of that to the source, right? It's not bhakti yet. It will become bhakti later. Again, so a literal translation of that, for example, could be work, because yoga means work, right? So a literal translation could be that. And it's not wrong, at least in this example, it works. But when we're talking about context and we're talking about a translator that also knows the person speaking very intimately and also understands, it's also differently when you have a whole book. It's like Srila Prabhupada wasn't like, Krishna didn't hand this to Prabhupada and was like, don't read ahead, just translate literally what I'm saying. It's like, no, he actually studied this. It's like the way he lives his life. He understands what the Bhagavad Gita is in such a deep way that nobody else does, or any of us did. To begin with, we are able to read the Bhagavad Gita as it is because of the translation work that Srila Prabhupada gave. So that should tell you that his translation is already successful because of all the lives that he has changed through his translation. So that's not even up for discussion. But what we are discussing is, well, if a really good translation or a perfect translation shouldn't be literal, then wouldn't you say that then it's not fair to say that the Bhagavad Gita is as it is because it's not a literal translation. So then it shouldn't be called as it is because as it is would mean literal, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is the point that I really want to clarify and answer. In translation, literal means, for example, in Spanish, it's, this is something that I came across at work this week. So in English, we say, oh, my head hurts, right? And in Spanish, it's actually incorrect, although you would still understand what the other person is saying if you said it wrong. But to speak in a native level, you would never say, mi cabeza me duele, my head hurts. You don't use my, you use the article, the. So literally, it would say, if I was to translate backwards from Spanish to English, literally it would say, the head hurts. And in English is weird. I mean, you could hear somebody say that, right? And be like, oh, I get it. He's talking about, or she's talking about her head. But it's not natural, and you would quickly understand that that person doesn't really master English. They know a little bit of English, and the message is conveyed, but you quickly understand what level they speak English, and then you just kind of go from there. So the same thing in Spanish. So you could say from English, somebody that's learning Spanish, mi cabeza me duele, and in Spanish you would understand, oh, this person is learning Spanish. They don't really know Spanish, because if they did, they would translate or say, la cabeza me duele, the head hurts, right? And if we're doing a literal translation. Is that clear so far?
Yes, yeah. I have another one, just for the sake of example. In Portuguese, we have the word céu. In English, if you would translate that, we would translate into sky. But also in English, we have the word heaven. But in Portuguese, there's no heaven, it's also céu. So céu means both sky and heaven. So if I say to you that I see an airplane flying in heaven, that's weird. Or if I say that there is an angel in the sky, I guess that's not so weird. But if there's a plane flying in heaven, like something's wrong with me if I tell you that I see that, right? So there's literally no other word for, there are two words in English, but there's only one in Portuguese, and that one in Portuguese is meant for both. So how do you translate that? You can't.
Exactly. You know? It's the same in Spanish. It's the same word. Cielo for the sky and cielo for heaven. They're
yes.
The same.
Yeah.
What a perfect example. And so this is where it comes in, where the expertise of a really good translator and interpreter comes in. This person has the knowledge of both languages. Hopefully, she and he, if they're expert, they speak both languages in a native level. And so they're not going to translate or interpret literally. They're going to take the context into consideration. They're going to take their audience into consideration. They're going to take the register into consideration, right? In Spanish, you can speak very formally according to who you're speaking with. And English is not so much. You speak the same way to your grandpa as you would speak to like your classmate. In Spanish, you don't. You use different words to refer to a senior and a junior and your friends and like your significant other and things like that. So each language has their own intricacies. And a translator, an expert translator, an interpreter will take all these different aspects and factors into consideration. So what we see as a translator and interpreter myself, when I see Prabhupada's translation work, first of all, I think he's like the greatest translator and interpreter there has ever existed, because he's not only translating Sanskrit, which is probably really difficult to learn. I've been studying it for 10 years and there's still a lot that I need to learn. But so he's not only, understands completely and way beyond material knowledge the significance and meaning of each word in Sanskrit, he also has such a high level of dominance of the English language. He also knows the Western culture so well that he could relate to us in such simple terms. And he's also very bold and confident in his translation. Mm-hmm. I have never read anywhere that Prabhupada went to translating school or was, trained by the best interpreters and translators in the world, or any university degree on translation. Maybe there is, I've never heard of this. I went to school, I did 4 years of translation stuff, and then I graduated, and then I went to a lot more years for translation school, and then I worked in such a high demanding environment. So yeah, I have some experience, but it's cost me a lot. Now I'm looking at this translation work, and I haven't heard of any of that happening with Prabhupada, yet he still has such a high level of dominance of both languages, the cultures of both languages, and he's able to maintain and protect the meaning that Krishna's conveying in Sanskrit in layman terms in English. Same register, I'm sure. It doesn't sound like the English translation is for a 2-year-old, so he's definitely not watering down the register, although I don't know Sanskrit. But how do I know he's not going off the tracks from a translator's point of view? He provides the word-for-word translation, which is something that, as we heard from Tukaram, nobody ever does. Mm-hmm. And even as a translator in the material aspect of life, for somebody to provide a word-for-word translation, I also haven't really seen that done. And it shows a lot of things, and I'm just going to point out one, which is the most obvious one. He cares, and he cares about us learning and being able to become masters at the source language, right? He's giving us his translation because that's our native tongue, or we know English, whoever is able to read the Bhagavad Gita as it is in English, and then he's giving us his own translation work, which is all the literal translations beautifully and masterfully put together in such a way that it makes sense for a native English speaker, context and culture and everything else included. And so and then he gives the purport, the meaning of the translation. So we're looking at the most amazing piece of translation work here, from a material standpoint and from a spiritual standpoint. Now, you mentioned about devotion, and we talked about how yoga could really just mean work. So why is it okay for a translator to inject something that's not really there in that context or in that text right in front? Well, in this case, and I think in any other case, for example, if I'm in the courtroom and I have been interpreting for this court case for months, some court cases go for months, trials go for months, because of witnesses and all these other things that need to be brought to in front of the judge and looked into and all that. If I've been the same translator through the whole process, now I'm gonna have more knowledge about what happened, who's the accused, what are the laws, what's the case law that's being used in this case, everything, the attorneys, everything that's going on, more than a new translator or an interpreter that's just coming in new. I bring this up because as a translator or interpreter that has been a part of this whole process, I have some room to be able to choose what is going to be the most beneficial terminology, taking into consideration everything, the length of the trial, what we've already been through, what's going on, at what part of the process we're in. I'm not going to start from scratch every day that we come in front of the judge. Like if the judge already explained what arraignment is, I'm not going to go through and do the interpretation of what arraignment was because 2 weeks ago the judge explained it in more layman terms. Now I'm just going to use the most concise terminology that has already been given by the source language, and I'm just going to go with that. Again, yes, taking into consideration, and the Gita devotion hasn't been introduced directly per se, although it has been hinted at throughout. It's not outside of the rules to be able to provide information that's still along the same lines. So we're talking about bhakti. Yoga will eventually become bhakti. And the reason why Prabhupada has included it throughout the whole Gita is because the whole Gita is about bhakti. It's like if we're reading about a catalog that's about bicycles, it's like, no, you can't talk about the wheel yet because it has not come up. So if I say something about the wheel, it's not like, oh, you're a bad translator. It's like, no, I already know the catalog. It's going to come up. And in order to explain this concept in the best way possible, I'm going to inject that because it's coming up, and it's going to just allow you to already become acquainted with all this terminology. So when we get there, you can better understand, oh, okay, this whole thing, like, yeah, it was all hinted at. And it's just enhancing the understanding of the topic at hand. And so that's just my, I would say that's my purport as a translator and an interpreter in, what I do as a job. And it really highlights, again, what a masterful job Prabhupada did at translating this, because he's giving us not only a clear understanding of what was said by Krishna in the original source language, but also allowing us to understand it and apply to our lives in such a practical way and in a way that we can understand it. I'm going to give one last example and then I'm going to stop, because I think it's what you asked me to explain is already understood. Idioms are a huge part of language. Now, in English, we say between a rock and a hard place. In Spanish, we say between a sword and the wall. If I were to say to you between a sword and the wall, you'd be like, what the heck? Like, what are you talking about? And if I were to say between a rock and a hard place in Spanish, nobody would understand what I was talking about. So that doesn't mean that I'm not a good translator, because I'm actually linking the correct direct, matching idioms. It just means that I actually know the culture, I know the context, I know what you're talking about, and I'm searching for the perfect match to what you gave me in the source language. And it's the same thing we're seeing here in Prabhupada's translation. Sanskrit is this is what Krishna means. Prabhupada is a very loyal follower of Krishna's words. Obviously, we have witnessed that through his life and his work, so we can say that with 100% conviction. But when we see the translation, he's also scanning through different options, and he gives those options in the word for word. And then in his translation work, we can see how he puts it all together. And this is the work that no machine in the world is able to do, as we've heard from many. And I'm sure as you have all tried to do on Google Translate, because nobody wants to pay for a real life translator and interpreter, because we pay for that, those skills that nobody can just replicate. So when you put that, all those different literal meanings of all these words that go into a sentence or a paragraph or whatever you're trying to explain, that's where the real magic happens. How the translator is able to connect all these different concepts in an understandable way, practical way, concise way. That's one of the rules in translating. If you can say the same thing in fewer words, that's what you go with. So being concise and being able to perfectly describe and convey the message without changing it for any other reason. So that's actually unethical. You can lose your license as a translator and interpreter if you try to explain something that's not conveyed in the message. So taking all those things into consideration and analyzing Prabhupada's work from that perspective, he's an A+++ translator and an interpreter, as we have heard him, reading out Sanskrit and on the spot interpreting. And actually that's how all his books have been translated. He would just read the Sanskrit and on a recorder interpret it. And in his interpretation, he was also, oh my gosh, this is another really important point. I'm so sorry this is going so long, but it's so important. He's also giving the explanation based on dozens of commentaries from his predecessors on this knowledge of transcendental knowledge. So for a translator to do things on their own, it's a little iffy. It's like nobody wants to just come up with a word. It's like you translate, and if somebody challenges that translation, you're supposed to show where you got it from. For Spanish is the RAE, Real Academia Española. It's an entity that it's like the highest authority in the Spanish language. And so if you're using a word that's not approved by the RAE, then you shouldn't be using it. So similarly, Srila Prabhupada, everything that he's interpreting and translating that eventually made it as a translation work is backed up by, again, dozens of commentaries of people that were also highly exalted bhakti yogis that through their own life and works demonstrated a very deep understanding of the scriptures and what bhakti yoga is. And so Prabhupada's translation is not only based on his own whims or whatever he wanted to write, it's actually backed up by other scholars, bhakti yoga scholars. And so this is another important point that I know that is really important to notice and to actually be aware of. It's like when we're reading the Bhagavad Gita, we're not only getting one person's transcendental realizations and translation experience and skill. We're getting thousands of years of knowledge that has come down from a bona fide and pure source, which is from teacher to teacher, with the sole purpose and with a lot of care to not change the meaning that was given by the speaker himself, which is Krishna. And I'll stop here unless there's any other questions or if there was something that I said that didn't make sense.
Thank you so much for the very detailed explanation of everything that goes into being able to interpret it or translate. It really highlights what it is that Prabhupada has done and what we have as a piece of jewel in the Bhagavad Gita. He, like you mentioned, even without training, apparently, not that we know of, was able to still act like a professional translator here and interpreter, because he was dictating on the tapes, right, as you know.
Yeah.
One thing that came to my mind as having our audience best interest in heart is that, well, why are we talking about translations for so long and all these details? Why do we need a professional person explaining the intricacies of what's going on in there? Well, if you're new to religion, then you may be asking yourself the question. I just want to point one thing out. In Krishna consciousness, we have, because of our seeing Krishna everywhere and in everything, we see Krishna in the animals also. So we abstain from foods that are being given to us through a violent means of killing an animal. So we become vegetarians. And when I have conversations about vegetarianism with Christians, they say, well, in the Bible, Jesus doesn't tell us that we should not eat meat. In fact, he even encourages us based on his actions. And I asked that person, what do you mean by that? Well, it is said there's a passage in the Bible where Christ, apparently, with one fish, he then multiplies that one fish into many, 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 and is able to feed thousands of people with fish. Well, there's the pescatarian approach. We put that in the meat category as well. As long as it can run for its life, it's an animal and it's meat. So we used to say that if you're eating fish, you're also eating meat, okay? Turns out that that's that particular translation of the Bible saying that Jesus Christ fed fish to thousands of people out of one fish. There are other translations of the Bible that says that Christ fed many people with bread. Well, those two translations are very different. One would imply that the teacher, Jesus Christ, would be okay with his disciples eating meat, and the other one, no, right? And also, wanting to go all the way down to the bottom of this case, when we looked at the Bible in Greek, in its original language, as it turns out, the actual word written there is seaweed, which is neither bread nor fish, and would again imply a vegetarian diet. So the reason why we do pay attention to translation or interpretation so much, especially when it comes down to religion, because we don't want to be blind followers, is because, again, like we mentioned, it is a very important job. You can mislead your audience in a very hurtful way. I think Varangi is like a very extraordinary example of that. Based on what she's saying, you can lead the jurors to get one image of the accused or another. In spiritual life, it can lead you to make spiritual progress or not. In my opinion, a lot of the reasons why religion, unfortunately, gets a bad name nowadays is because of things like this: mistranslations, misinterpretations, which creates even more confusion rather than a loving environment. So the reason why we are discussing translations and interpretations at such a great detail, and so fortunate to have a professional translator and interpreter here, is because of that. Prabhupada took great pride. He is saying, you know, Bhagavad Gita as it is, you know, so that's why we are taking such a time here to talk about translation and interpretation in such details. So thank you, Varangi, for that. It really highlights its value and its importance, and how by applying that to religion, it leads us into a beautiful place.
Yeah, what a brilliant point. Thank you for bringing that up. It's so key in completing this little mini seminar on the importance of translation. And yeah, why doesn't say Bhagavad Gita literal Bhagavad Gita? It's like, because translation doesn't work like that. There is a little meaning to be given for a word, and then there's translation work, which is taking that meaning of the word in whatever natural context it's understood by the people in the source in the target language. And so that's why it's as it is, because the message is not being diluted, the message is not being changed. The translator is actually being very loyal to the source language and to the speaker in conveying that message and really protecting the integrity of that source language.
Exactly.
And we see that in the way that Prabhupada breaks up each translation of each verse. Nobody does this unless you really care, and unless you're not trying to get something for yourself, right? And we see the impact of great translation work is leading people towards the right place, you know. Of course, taking into consideration what you're translating. You can also translate terrible things and lead masses of people towards a cliff. And so, yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons why this work really is attractive to me, and I'm really happy that in my spiritual life it's such a big part of it, and it's so important. So I hope that in the future I can do some translation work for my teachers, hopefully. But yeah, thank you for that point. It's really important.
Thank you.
Sorry, Kim.
No, not at
We've
all.
been like talking so much.
It's so valuable. It's so interesting to me hearing the art of translation. particularly like the examples you used, Varangi, was really kind of laid it all out there why literal just does not work. So I think Prabhupada, as you said, he did the translation word by word, he did the purport, and he basically showed his math, which, as Tukram said, not many translators have done in the past, where Prabhupada went to a full purport. As you said, he referenced other saints and scholars and other texts, Vedic texts and sacred, scripts. So yeah, he had nothing to hide. That's what I really appreciated. And in doing that, I think it's also exemplifying how he does not want us to have blind faith in any regard. He shows exactly how he got there. So
beautiful point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I wanted to say that we have a link to our bookstore at Laguna Beach Temple for all the books that Prabhupada wrote, and including the Gita. If you want to get a book, you can go online and buy it, and the cost is very cheap. It barely covers the cost to make the book itself. And if you can't afford a book, I have a few here that I'd be willing to send you. So yeah, I encourage you to pick up a Gita, Bhagavad Gita as it is, and dive in. So thank you guys. We went a little longer today, but that's okay.
I know, it's just one verse, right? So much to talk about.
Yeah. I think it's important though to highlight how just the art of translation, how gifted Prabhupada was, how empowered he was. So it's worth it.
Totally. Especially, I know we're trying to conclude, but especially, I'm sure a lot of the people that might come across these episodes have come across other translations of the Gita, or even just other books by other, I don't know, Indian or Eastern teachers, so-called gurus also, that have really manipulated Krishna's words into fitting something for themselves. And we see this all the time. I hear it like on Facebook and Instagram, it comes up so much of like, kind of like fake gurus. It's like, oh, and the Bhagavad Gita is about yourself and you becoming God. It's like, what? The Sanskrit doesn't say that. And I'm not a Sanskrit pundit, but I have a Sanskrit pundit here, Srila Prabhupada, who translated that mom means me and the speaker is Krishna. I'm not Krishna. I never said that. Like, so but having that is really powerful. Like Soza brought up, it really having a translation, but somebody that has the credentials to translate. And again, even though he doesn't, I've never read that he went to train or anything, we could see his work word by word, and we have direct access to Sanskrit dictionaries. So even if you wanted to see if what he's saying is true, you have access to that online as well through the Sanskrit English dictionary to double check if this translation work is actually correct, right? And so it's so important, and this is why we bring it up so much. It's like this translation, it actually is taking care of protecting the integrity of what was said by the speaker and really helping you develop some basic understanding of the languages so you don't get diluted or really cheated by other translations that may say something that's catchy or cool, but that may not really actually be the truth. And that's something that's very rampant today and very easily available today, is finding translations that are like super, they sound really great and we're all one and you can become God. And yeah, that's not really what the text says. So if you're really interested in truth, then I highly recommend this translation because it's actually translated properly and with the credentials right there for you to verify yourself. And so, yeah, I just highly encourage it.
Thinking that we may not talk about this again, I just want to bring one last point home. I'll make it quick. The importance of translation, right? Again, especially with religion, because here, what Krishna is actually encouraging Arjuna to do is to go and fight and kill people. So it's probably pretty dangerous Like some guru come along and say, hey, I'm God, because it says here that I am in the Sanskrit that you don't truly understand. And I want you to go over there and kill those people around the corner. And that's another reason why religion gets such a bad name nowadays, like jihadist missions, right? Killing, wars based on religion, religious war, it turns so many people off. And then now here's Krishna in the battlefield, urging Arjuna to go and fight and kill. It's like, okay, just more of the same. But no, like Varangi mentioned, it is such an important and valuable word to convey the message that was intended by the source to the target. And Krishna's message to Arjuna wasn't to just be violent and just go kill everybody who didn't accept him as God. That was not it. But we need to truly understand what was Krishna's motives, what was Krishna really trying to say. And having the access to the actual source Sanskrit, but not being able to understand it, you are fully at the mercy of the person who is translating that for you. And they have to be able to capture that and not become jihadist and thinking that, oh yeah, Krishna wants me to kill people, so I'm going to go out and kill people. It's like, no, Prabhupada is putting over here, working devotion. Devotion means you love everybody, not that you kill everybody. And that's the actual lesson that Krishna was trying to convey. So again, we can see how this translation and interpretation is so important, especially with Gita, because you may very easily get the understanding that, well, Krishna is just urging me to fight, you know, but you would miss the point. But because we have such an expert translator and interpreter of the Gita, we know that actually we don't even kill an animal to eat. We love everything and everybody, but it is required that the translation and the interpretation really captures, and that you're really familiar with the source culture to be able to give it to the target culture.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening, and we look forward to having you join us again next week. And thank you guys for the lively discussion. I loved it. And we'll see you again. We'll see you again next week. Haribol.
Hare
Hare Krishna.